I'm Jeff Asher, and this is the Jeff-alytics podcast. Crime sells in headlines, on the news, and across every corner of social media. But what happens when the attention economy starts distorting our understanding of public safety? Even when the numbers say otherwise, the feeling of danger sticks. In this episode, I talk with journalist Philip Bump about why this disconnect persists and what it says about how we consume information. We explore how media coverage, political narratives, and technology shape our sense of danger, often amplifying fear even when crime is steady or declining. He shares insights on the role of social media, the rise of surveillance technology, and why, if it bleeds, it leads, continues to dominate the news cycle. We also talk about what it might take to shift towards more data-driven conversations about public safety and how policymakers and the press can bridge the growing gap between perception and reality. Now let's get on to my conversation with Philip Bump about fears, facts, and the stories that shape how we see crime. Philip, thanks for joining the show.
I am extremely happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
First off, I was wondering if you could take me through your background, just sort of what is your background? How did you get to where you are now and what you're doing now?
Sure. Well, I used to work for the CIA and I live in New Orleans. Sorry, that's sorry. No, not my own sheet. Sorry about that. Let me check my notes. I have a weird background. I worked for Adobe Systems for a while as a designer, and I worked I ran independent political campaigns, and I did various things. But the through line to it, I worked for the Washington Post. I was at the Washington Post for more than a decade as a columnist. And the through line to those things is that I would try and explain things to people, often using data. You know, my columns at the Post were usually centered around data. And I wrote a newsletter for the Post called How to Read This Chart, which was obviously also focused on data. So that's sort of my background. So it was data presentation in a lot of different guises that led me to this point and to this conversation.
And I know that this is the third-ish episode that we've got coming out of the podcast. And I realized that thinking about this, we haven't actually gone into the data behind, why is crime underperceived? Why are people so wrong about what is happening in crime? Often, not always, but often they think it's rising when it's falling. Sometimes they think it's rising when it's rising. Rarely do people think that it's falling when it's falling. So I know you've written a lot about this. Could you take me through just sort of what the data shows us as far as what people perceive and what the data shows?
I appreciate you asking me to talk about the data as opposed to answering the question of the why, because I'm not sure we really know the answer to the question.
That's the next question.
Right. Okay. Oh, great. Okay. Sorry. I sort of stepped on a little bit. What the data shows and has shown for quite some time is that people tend to think that crime is increasing. Right. That's the short answer. That people are asked, do you think crime is going up or down? And people say, I think crime is going up. That has been consistently the pattern. That was the pattern. Yeah. If I remembering correctly, which I think I am, even back when crime was at its most dramatic decline during the 1990s, like you asked people then and people still were concerned about crime, still often thought that crime was going up. I think that recently we have seen a lot of polling because crime has become more salient in the political conversation because of Donald Trump's machinations around crime. We're seeing polling, including from YouGov last month, that shows that people not only think that crime is rising, but think crime is particularly bad in cities and so on and so forth, which I think gets to the second question, which I'm happy to transition into, or I can also just let you ask it if you'd like to do it that way.
It's literally the next question.
Is very good. Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is because it is much, much more useful for political actors in particular, but also members of the media to present crime as though it is a problem than it is to present crime as though it is not as much of a problem. Right. There's a lot more utility for everyone except incumbent politicians to talk about crime as being something that needs to be addressed than as something that is being successfully addressed. That's true of the media, which likes to report stories about crime. That's true of politicians who are challenging other politicians or who are challenging the party in power. And I think part of it, too, derives from the fact that there's so much political power held by law enforcement, right? The law enforcement is an incredibly powerful institution, regardless of the politics of a particular place. And obviously for law enforcement, it is more useful to say that they are needed than to say that they are less needed than they used to be and deserve less funding than they used to. And so I think that's part of it too, is that law enforcement is a very important and potent political actor. And I think that it is therefore useful for Americans to understand or perceive that they are more needed than less. But that's all anecdotal. Let me point out that's my surmising.
I think you've hit the nail on the head with a lot of it, but wouldn't there be a balancing at some point where the police department recording their stats also wants to show, hey, we're doing a good job. The incumbent mayor, the incumbent governor wants to show that we're seeing this go down. Wouldn't that at some point balance these things out, or is the power from outside just so much more?
Yeah, I mean, you do see that, right? You do see legislators and mayors in particular who have overseen these crime drops. I mean, like Rudy Giuliani would constantly talk about how, he was driving down crime, even though crime was already declining when he was, before he became mayor, and continued to decline after he was mayor. You do see legislators and politicians who run on this, but at the same time, there still is a lot of external pressure to say it's not good enough, that it could be happening faster. I mean, look at the discourse we're having right now. Like, crime is down in Washington, D.C., but Donald Trump is saying the crime is bad because it serves his political goals. Right. And the mayor of Washington, D.C., who could help, take some credit for crime going down theoretically, is siding with that. From the police department standpoint, which I think is probably less of a factor than, say, the media. But, from the police department standpoint, they have a budget. Right. You look at the discourse around defund the police. Even if you look at it just as a function of taking away money that's no longer needed because they're doing such a good job, defund the police was not something that was embraced. And I actually looked at the time when that was part of the narrative, part of the political conversation. I looked and there was simply no correlation between the amount of money that police departments were getting and violent crime, right? They kept getting more and more money and violent crime kept going down, or sometimes it would go up, and it didn't matter. There was no link between the two, but those budgets kept going up anyway.
What do you make of the idea that people don't respond to crime numbers because they respond to things that maybe aren't criminal, that like disorder? And I've seen that thrown around. Charles Lehman with the Manhattan Institute, I think, does great work and has talked about this a lot. Financial Times had a piece on this. Like, they see shoplifting. They see even things that are associated with crime but are not criminal, like homelessness, and take their cues from that. Do you think that that is a major factor in all this, or is that just sort of an explanation that takes the blame away from what's actually happening as far as politicians and the media?
No, I think that's certainly the case. I mean, people do see disorder and see it as being something that needs to be tended to, and sort of lump it into, a sense of discomfort, if you will, that, obviously crime can play into. But I mean, it's also, of course, the case that individual acts of crime that receive an undue amount of attention can drive that sentiment as well. I mean, the discussion that we're seeing these days around this horrific killing on the train in North Carolina, right? It's this one isolated act. It's horrible, obviously shouldn't have happened, and, needs to be investigated. But, it is not itself a proxy for crime broadly, right? But because this one thing happened, and because, so-and-so was on the subway and saw something similar, right? We do get this sort of anecdotal thing about stuff that isn't crime, but also is crime, that then helps feed a conversation that contributes to this idea that crime is worse than it actually is.
So I want to read a quote, and you sent this to me yesterday morning when it came out. Crime is not a data thing, it's a feelings thing. It's not about whether you're a victim, it's whether you feel a victim or not. So what do we do with that? I mean, I'm trying to form a question around that, but it's so cynical and it's so antithetical to everything as far as the role of government and the role of media and the role of perception. What do you do if that's the driving force behind somebody? How do you address something like that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this is a quote. I don't know if you said it's from a Trump administration official on background to Axios, right? I mean, it's, in a sense, it's obviously not wrong, right? This goes to the point we were just talking about, that crime is not, when we talk about perception of crime, it is not based on that. It is, in fact, based on gut feelings. But part of the job of both the media and elected leaders is to reinforce to people, this thing that you are afraid of is actually that it is actually going better than you think it is. And this is tricky. This is the whole point, is that this is a hard argument to make. It's hard to say to people, I know you feel scared, but you don't need to feel scared, right? This is always a difficult thing for an elected official or the media to do. And I feel like the media has more space to do it, but it is also much more difficult to do, when you have countervailing forces that are saying, no, actually, it's really bad because it serves their use. But it's particularly hard to do when the countervailing force saying, no, actually, it's bad, is the president of the United States, who's doing it because he has an agenda that he'd like to affect, that he is leveraging crime in order to put into place. So I don't know what you do with that besides point out that this is cynical and point out that this is an unhelpful way of keeping Americans informed and keeping Americans confident about the state of America. But if that's not your goal as a president, then that's not going to hold much sway.
Is there a good way for policymakers to balance? I mean, you ran political campaigns. If you were advising a candidate, maybe an incumbent, as far as you want to acknowledge your progress, you want to acknowledge, hey, murder's down 18%. We've reduced violent crime by 32% over the last 3 years. We're doing great. With sort of the anecdote of, okay, murder's down 18%, but there were still 50 of them that, each one is a tragedy, each one is a potential story. How is it possible to responsibly balance that where you're acknowledging the tragedy, but you're also acknowledging the policy and the success?
I don't know. I that's not a helpful response, but I think it depends to some extent on the circumstances, right? It is going to be very hard right now for Charlotte to say, actually everything is safe because, this story about this killing on the train is all over the news. And frankly, looking at your data that murders in Charlotte have not gone down. It sort of looks like they rose around the COVID era and have not really changed much since then. I think that one of the things that can be done in this moment with this discussion around crime is to point out the motivations of the people who are drawing attention to crime, whether it is the president who is trying to backstop his efforts in DC and Chicago and elsewhere, or if it is the people who are essentially doing race baiting by focusing on this crime in North Carolina, which involved a black assailant and a attractive young blonde Ukrainian immigrant. There is obviously an aspect to it there that is less about crime than it is about race that I think is underappreciated as well. But it's necessary to look at the circumstances and to address the circumstances and to point out, what the motivations are of the people that are drawing undue attention to crime. I think one of the things that has been successful over time is in people saying, if it bleeds, it leads, is the approach of local news. And I think people understand that local news spends more time talking about crime. And I think people also understand that Fox News spends more time talking about crime than is warranted based on the data about crime. But that said, it's hard to ignore that. And there's a lot of potency in those stories and a lot of ability of those stories to attract attention, which of course is why those stories exist. And I'll just point out that in 2022, as crime started to go down, again, as your data shows, and eventually as other data like the FBI showed, Fox News was really hammering on crime, saying crime is up and crime is terrible and crime is bad and yada, yada, yada. And I wrote pieces first noting that there really wasn't good data on that. There wasn't an objective way to assess whether crime was up in the way that they were articulating it was. But then secondarily, to suggest that, all they were doing was compiling anecdotes. And, they got very incensed about that and disparaged me on air. But of course it was true, right? That, that crime was not rising in the way that they said, that crime was not as horrific as they had presented. But even by pushing back on them, right, it didn't do any good. Right? It's not like, I don't know that I convinced many people who weren't already skeptical of Fox News that this wasn't the case. And, if you're an elected official, particularly a Democrat who's going to try and take on Fox News in that way, I'm not sure how much success you're going to have.
So let's brainstorm, because I feel like the knife can cut both ways. That yes, they're using anecdotes. You can use anecdotes to show whatever you want. You can show a next door video of a porch pirate and believe that everyone's stealing, everyone's package is getting stolen, even if it happened twice out of 10,000 packages, whatever. Are there ways to on the flip side, take advantage of these new technologies, these new means of reaching people that, Fox News says what they want to say, but Fox News is not why 18 to 29-year-olds think that crime is rising, because they're not watching Fox News for the most part. Are there ways to use TikTok, YouTube, new means of reaching people that weren't available when it was, the Washington Post and the New York Times, the LA Times, and that's how people got their news? Are there ways to do this that maybe take advantage of the changing media?
Yes, I think that's certainly the case. And you raise an interesting point about Ring cameras and so on that I want to come back to. But yeah, I think it certainly is the case that you're essentially asking, are there ways of presenting true information to people outside of the context of traditional media? And the answer is yes, right? That's true of crime. That's true of a lot of other things. And I think that we see on these platforms a lot of discussions of the ways in which the cynical quote that we cited from the Trump administration official, that, things like that are called out for being cynical or being opportunistic, right? You can do that. Of course, the challenge with a lot of these platforms is they're algorithm driven, and people will see things that they respond to and interact with. And so, my guess is that people who would see a message like that are more likely to be inclined to being skeptical of the administration's approach in the first place. So, I don't know if you're going to reach a whole lot of people who need to hear the message necessarily that way. I do think it's sort of fascinating, talking generally about new media. One of the things that I think was an underappreciated factor in the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, which then led to the backlash Blue Lives Matter movement and this sort of rallying around the cops that Trump really leveraged in both 2020 and 2024, is camera phones, right? That, there was all these camera phones that were omnipresent in 2014 and helped capture a lot of killings of Black people in particular by police officers. Killing George Floyd, for example, captured on camera phones, and that really helped power that movement. One of the things I think we're seeing now is we are seeing similar use of these ring cameras and so on and so forth, or the footage on the train in North Carolina. Again, we are seeing a similar circumstance in which a lot of video footage is being used to construct a narrative that is a counteracting narrative, is a narrative that promotes, exactly to your point, this idea that crime is bad. It's sort of this fascinating yin to the yang of the rise of Black Lives Matter and really focusing to really leverage smartphones. And I think that too is sort of underappreciated, that now we live in this moment where video is so easy to share and video is so easy to clip and comment on and so on and so forth, that it makes it easier to drive these narratives that we're seeing and make this whole situation worse.
Is there a counter to that? I guess the challenge is that you can't make a video about no crime occurring. If I go out on my street and say, look, I'm not being mugged, that's not a thing. Is there a way to take advantage of that using the same technologies? Or do you think that it's always going to be just this helps to feed the anecdotes, which helps to feed the opinion?
Well, I think this comes back to the original question, which is how do you counteract this sense, right? If you figure out how to counteract that sense, then you can use technologies. I mean, honestly, I think you probably could do a camera, like, just showing that nothing's happening, and do that as a pointed statement, like do that in Times Square, do a live stream from Times Square and be like, look, nothing happened here for for 8 hours or whatever it happens to be, right? But again, I think that the way to do that is to present a conversation about why, the root of the problem here isn't the crime or the lack of crime. The root of the problem is that people are able to extract power from presenting crime as worse than it is. And so if you get at the way that people are extracting power and why they're using this particular issue to try and extract power and address that, I think that's the potent thing. The challenge, of course, though, is that, there are people who don't want to hear that. Donald Trump doesn't want to hear that, much less present that to his base. There are a lot of people who are sort of skeptical broadly about what's happening in the United States who don't necessarily want to hear it. And then, of course, you have this issue of, this overlaps with the broader problem in the media, which is how do you tell people who are poorly informed or underinformed what's happening in the world if they're choosing not to be informed? And the answer is we don't know, right? This is, why mainstream media is struggling, because we haven't come up with an answer for people who aren't interested in being informed. How do you inform them? Right. And we don't know. And that holds true for everything and not just crime.
Are there other subjects that you can think of? I mean, I know you don't just cover crime. You've written a lot about crime, I think, very effectively. Are there other subjects that you can think of that are like this, where the disconnect is so different from the reality?
Yeah, sure, man. Like immigration, right? Like, I mean, there are any number of things, I think. And I think a lot of the things that Donald Trump ran on in 2024 are things that probably fall into this category, right? Like trade deficits, right? Like, there are a range of things for which hard data exists, but a gut sentiment exists that contradicts what the raw data says. And, in part because Donald Trump runs toward that gut instinct and runs on that gut instinct, it has made it more difficult for these things to be able to be talked about in a way that respects what the reality on the ground is. It used to be that, yes, crime was accepted, but immigration, at least, I think everyone in Washington was at least on the same page about what the reality of immigration was, and say, when the Gang of Eight was putting together their immigration proposals in 2011 and 2012, or whatever it was, like there's at least a shared reality there. But because Donald Trump has prioritized this response to, gut reactions and feelings about things as opposed to what the facts are, I think that has made those things more potent, made it more difficult to counteract with data.
And getting back, you said you wanted to get back to the Ring cameras, so let's get back to those. How much do you think that technologies like that are, one, put you face to face with your assailant in a way that they didn't before, and then two, you can kind of combine those with Reddit, with Nextdoor, with places for communities essentially for you to share it online? How much do you think that impacts our perceptions?
Man, Nextdoor, I swear to God, Nextdoor is the weirdest social media network. It really is. It's just a bunch of, and I don't, I wrote a whole book about the baby boom generation and, the age differences. So I'm not trying to be disparaging here, but it really does seem to be a lot of elderly people who see a dude walk by their house and post, someone walked by my house at 2:45 p.m. and I'm not sure exactly what he's doing. And if anyone has any information, if you can talk to the police, I mean, it's crazy, right? Like you've seen these things and you get alerts on your phone, right? Like, it's like Nextdoor alert. I saw this person near my house. It's like, yeah, dude, you live in this society. Like, what the hell? Like, yes, this is what occurs as people move and drive around. And I think that really does do it. Like people are very vigilant about what's happening around their homes, particularly a certain type of person is very vigilant about what's happening around their homes. I think honestly that combination of Ring and Nextdoor is probably should have been mentioned at the top in terms of what's feeding this perception. It's not totally fair since the perception's longstanding. But yeah, I think that is bad. And this was my point, like that this is sort of the inverse of BLM, right? Like BLM showed real footage of things happening to people that caused a backlash. Here we have technology being used in a way that spurs a surreal sense of what's actually happening in the world in a misleading sense of what's happening in the world.
Now thinking big picture, is this a problem that gets better as sort of the generation, especially the sort of the Ring Nextdoor issue? Does this get better when the generation that's sort of the most complainy is also the one that grew up with this technology? Or is this something, or at least grew up with computers? Or is this something that we're sort of like each new generation is going to become the crotchety one that's yelling at Nextdoor?
No, it's a great question because you have this confluence of things, which is Ring cameras, Nextdoor. God, I'm being so ungenerous here, but this sense that seems very common among old people that, the society is deteriorating and that, that the nefarious actors are creeping around. But then you also have home ownership, right? Like who owns homes, right? A lot of young people just don't have the privilege of putting a Ring camera outside because their landlord won't let them do it, right? So yeah, I think there's this weird little nexus. I do think that there is probably an eternal challenge that we are going to have with people feeling as though they are being victimized by shadowy, unseen figures that will probably be sustained. But this may be particularly acute at the moment for a combination of factors.
I hate to go on a tangent. I'm remembering a couple of years ago, my buddy Martin, who lives near me, was walking his dog, and I see this on a Nextdoor alert that somebody, and there's this link that like thread of the day is several comments, and it's a video of him. He's walking the dog goes to poop. He reaches for the bag, realizes he doesn't have a bag. And then what are you supposed to do at that point? He walks off, and it's like comment after comment of his neighbors just saying, and it's my buddy who's lives nearby and forgot a bag, and that happens.
Yeah.
I guess, to your point though, that it gets blown out of proportion. It's not some random person from somewhere else coming by and purposely defacing the neighborhood. It's just one of your neighbors that forgot a bag. And we're very ungenerous with that, I feel like.
Yeah, I think that's true. I will say, as a dog owner who's walked in cities, you find a big leaf and you chuck it somewhere else. Is the solution there? But yeah, I mean, it is this sense that you have access to information that no one else does, that you get to share it. It's that goose of social media engagement, right? That is the lifeblood of social media. But in this case, it is just amplifying non-issues into significant issues. Again, if it weren't for the fact that these patterns existed decades ago, I might be inclined to say, yeah, we might be onto something about this being particularly difficult. But again, these patterns have existed for a long time. So,
well, and you go back a century ago and you look at some of the quotes from the 1920s when the police chiefs were getting together in the IACP to form UCR. And it's all about how, hey, the public thinks there's crime waves, but the data doesn't really exist to prove that. And so we need to standardize this. And you go through the history. So, I mean, I'm in the same point that, you can go back to the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, and you see the same trends as far as that. So you were at the Washington Post. Obviously, the media landscape is changing quite a bit. How do you think that change will affect how the public perceives crime? And is there an optimistic case where it makes it better?
Well, I think the challenge that we have in the moment that I hope passes is that people expect bespoke news that conforms to their prejudices and desires, right? Like that's really the issue that the mainstream media is having, is that people don't want to hear things that they don't want to hear. And it is the job of news organizations, and it is the structure of news organizations to present things to people that they may not want to hear, that may conflict with their, prejudices or existing beliefs. That's one of the ways that Donald Trump was successful, and one of the ways in which Fox News is successful, by creating an alternative to that, an alternative discussion ecosystem, which, has been very successful. But I don't know if perhaps there is a path forward. I don't know what it is, right? And I don't think anyone in the mainstream media does. I think there's a lot of effort put into reaching people where they are, which means on these platforms, on TikTok and so on and so forth. And the Washington Post, spent a lot of time focused on TikTok and, and Instagram Reels and doing short form video. And you still see a lot of people doing that. But I don't know that the medium is the solution, right? I think that a lot of people just sort of assume you get it on there and then these people will see it and then everything will change. And, maybe there's an aspect of that's true, but I don't think it's generally true just because all algorithms work against it. So I don't know. It's hard for me to be optimistic. I left the Washington Post, a month or so ago. Prior to that, I had written for Neiman Lab, which does a lot of media assessment, that, the media needed to do a better job of defending itself. But, I admitted, I don't know what the solution is. I don't know how the media ensures that people are better informed particularly if people aren't interested in being better informed, but also if people react negatively to being informed, and then that influences either literal or figurative algorithms about where they get their news.
So part of this project part of it is having just great discussions like this about what are perceptions, what can we do about it. The other part is in certainly expanding in basically all the things that the Washington Post did, but with a heavy focus on crime and crime trends and evaluating what the data says. And I will say that should these trends change, should things start rising, I was the one writing for the New York Times in 2021 about how much murder was rising. So I'm not afraid to say that things are rising if they're rising. What advice do you have for trying to do better at that short form video for that medium and marrying that with where people are coming from? And it may be no advice because
no, yeah. I think that, some of my most successful videos that I did at the Washington Post, like one of them had a bunch of charts which was unusual. One of them had my dog in it. I think a hook always helps, but you're asking the wrong dude, honestly. I wish I knew. I wish I could tell you how to be successful. I spent 11 years working for a newspaper and writing for the web primarily. I do videos on occasion. I can say as a layperson and as a consumer, the sorts of things that I find compelling. And, I think you do have to be interesting, and I think you have to be compelling, even if, it's sort of hard to make a lot of these issues compelling. I think one of the reasons I embrace data visualization and spend a lot of time on data visualization is because it is a way of taking data and making it so that it is compelling, right? You don't have to just write a paragraph that says, crime's actually down 14% in X and Y and yada, yada, yada. You make these great interactives as well, so people could explore the data themselves. That doesn't convert, that's hard to convey into a video format, but doing that, making it more accessible and making it more compelling, I think is crucial. But, again, I feel like a broken record, but I that's about the extent of my guessing on how to be successful.
Yeah. So have my dog host the videos is what my major take.
Sincerely, I actually thought at one point, I was like, what if I took all my columns and just put I have this big dumb looking dog, Stan. I have this big dumb looking dog who, if I just read my columns while he sat there and looked like a big galoot, I bet people would be into that. Who knows? Maybe else to do it. So future.
Yeah, I hate pop culture, but you're probably right.
Yeah, man. I'd watch it. If someone was just here's the daily news from Stan the dog, I feel like people be into it. So,
where's Beignet? We're gonna get her on here.
We should make moves. That's what we should do. Let's just end this podcast, have both our dogs on here, and make it all video. That's perfect.
Exactly. We'll just we got it all set. All right. So, what does the future look like with all of this? Is there any thoughts on? Yeah, we're going deep. This is the last area to get to is what's next for you? What's next for, do you have any thoughts on what the perceptions of crime trends are going to be or what's next for how sort of the president's current approach is going to affect how Gallup will come out with their next poll in a few months and they'll show X% of people thought that crime was rising. Do you think that there's anything to that or that anything's going to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I was actually, before this conversation, I looked and see what Gallup does this regular polling on what the most important issue facing America is. And I looked, and the most recent data that they have available was for August, and only 3% of Americans thought crime was the most significant thing. One of the things that we saw during 2024, for example, was that as Trump started talking about immigration shot up on that chart among Republicans. So I think we're going to see crime increase there because it has become, as I said earlier, a salient part of the conversation. I think that obviously that it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the United States broadly, because we're in this unfamiliar territory of a proto-authoritarian who is acting outside of the bounds of normal democratic behavior. And so it's sort of hard to anticipate where that goes. I think that there are a lot of places that are pushing back on what he's trying to do in terms of his quote unquote war on crime, which is really, about something other than that, I think it's safe to say. And so it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. I think that assuming that America continues to have competitive elections, all these insane caveats that we have to apply to things now, I think that it may be the case that we enter an era in which there is more respect for reality as it stands, right? And there is more of a willingness to say, okay, what's actually happening? Like, I get, it's easy to play to people, there may be some sort of backlash against this. This is extremely idealistic. And as a data nerd, it's, it's almost utopian, but, it may be the case that, we enter a new era in which people in America are willing to say, okay, I know how I feel, but what's the reality here? Because we went down this path of going, following feelings and, having people in leadership who say things, crime is not a data thing, it's a feeling thing. We get away from that. And maybe we go back to, okay, maybe it is a data thing. So I hold out hope that maybe that can happen. But, again, the running theme of this conversation has been decades where people thought crime was bad, even when it's been going down. And here we are.
I like the idea of a future where we data nerds will reign supreme as the arbiters of truth. So
datocracy, that's it.
And what about for you? You're out of the Washington Post, you're writing now. Do you have any big plans for the future?
Yeah, no, I'm trying to find a job. I've been having conversations with folks. I'm feeling comfortable about my spot. I'm not yet panicking or anything. I've been writing at pbump.net. If people are interested, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Blue Sky mostly at pbump.com, which is also where you can buy my book, which is about the baby boom, if people are interested. But yeah, TBD. I was at the Post for a solid 11 years and writing a lot. And so it's kind of nice to get to write at my own pace and also hang out with my kids and try and get my son to be a better hitter. That's my current project.
I know the challenge.
Yes, sir. He's a great kid and he's great at baseball, but he does not like to hit. We got to work on it. So that's sort of all.
Have to work on that. How are you going to retire early if they're not going to be paid?
That's right. If he's not playing for the New York Mets, that's it.
There you go. All right. Phil Bump, thank you for joining us. I hope you'll come back sometime. Thanks for listening to the Jeff-alytics podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and to learn more, head on over to ahdatalytics.com for more information and previous episodes. If you like what you heard, please leave a glowing review, which will help others to discover the show. Until next time, I'm Jeff Asher.